Welcome everyone to What Does Consent Mean for Generation Genome? I'm Sarah Norcross and I'm the Director of the Progress Educational Trust. Progress Educational Trust, PET for short, is a charity. We were founded back in 1992 to advance public understanding of genetics, assisted conception and embryology. And we aim to improve choices for people who are affected by genetic conditions and infertility. And we do this by promoting the responsible application of science and engaging with the public. There are three main areas to our work: leading the debate, so identifying the challenging topics and providing the forum and encouraging meaningful public discussion; influencing policy, because this is really important so that science and policy are better aligned and reflect the best interests of the patients and the public; and informing and explaining, holding events like this one and publishing accurate and unbiased news in BioNews, our online publication. And for all these reasons, we're really happy to be working with Genomics England to bring you this event discussing consent in the context of genomics, and doing this following on from the launch of the Chief Medical Officer's report Generation Genome back in July. So, how do you think about consent when you're consenting to something? Are you one of these people who just think the answer's yes, but what's the question? Whatever, I'm going to post it on Facebook anyway? Or are you someone who worries about it and ties yourself in knots thinking about the what ifs and create these weird and wonderful thought experiments that, you know, might give you nightmares and great anxiety, but give bioethicists fantastic ideas for grant applications? Or are you probably somewhere in between? So that's the sort of way I was thinking about it in a way. And recently we became aware of a conference that was offering delegates a free whole genome sequence as an incentive to attend. And we could probably spend the whole evening discussing the ethics of doing that actually, and what ends up with that data and where that's shared and who uses that. Anyway, that's something to ponder on. Anyway, I'm delighted that we didn't need to offer such a gimmick to get all you lot here tonight. So that's fantastic. And, you know, the genomics conversation that that Genomics England are running is now in its second phase, and we're really excited to be involved with this because, you know, it's really crucial to make sure that there are these opportunities to listen to people's concerns, you know, to give them information, to have different people presenting information, so that this can be sort of fed back into the project and it continues to earn and retain people's trust as the project continues. And we're going to be doing more events for Genomics England, so you'll have to keep following us on Twitter and looking at our webpage to find out when the next one is going to be, because that's work in progress, shall we say. So tonight's chair is Professor Bill Newman. Bill is Professor of Translational Genomic Medicine at the University of Manchester and Director of the Manchester Centre for Genomic Medicine for the 100,000 Genomes Project. So he's extremely well qualified to chair this event, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Bill.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I started in clinical genetics, genomic medicine as it is now, I suppose, over 20 years ago. And at that time, the very first meeting I went to in York, there was a big discussion about what we should do about testing in children, whether that was a sensible thing to do, who should make the decision about that, whether you should wait until children have grown up or whether parents have responsibility for that. And I think it's very true that a number of people in our profession and out with the profession have been thinking about these consenting issues for a very long time. And I think today and this evening hopefully will be an opportunity to see what we've learned over from that time, what's changed over the last number of years, and how we've been challenged with some of these new technologies that we're starting to use. Not every element of what we're thinking about is completely new. And so we're really lucky to have four great speakers who are going to give slightly different perspectives, I think, on this question of consent. And one of the big challenges, I think, is that when I first started in genetics, and up until really very recently, when we saw a patient in the clinic and we wanted to do a genetic test, we were really only able to look at one gene at a time. And now, suddenly, quite remarkably, you can do a test that can look at all 25,000 in a single go. I mean, there's lots of challenges about that, but in theory, you can do that. I just wonder, are we in a situation where there's a very esteemed journal called Private Eye, which I spend a lot of time browsing through and chuckling away to myself. And there's a wonderful cartoon this week of a guy sitting in front of a computer and looking at the screen, and it says, if you can't be bothered to read the terms and conditions, the pages and pages of them, tick this box. And that's where sometimes we might be. How much information do we need to really give informed consent, and how do we make sure that that truly is possible? So it's a great pleasure to introduce the first of our speakers, a wonderful colleague, Professor Anneke Lucassen, who's Professor of Genetics at the University of Southampton, and she's leader of the Clinical Ethics and Law Research Group there. And she's contributed enormously to this field, particularly through co-writing a chapter on ethics to the Chief Medical Officer's report, Generation Genome, recently, and also to the National Data Guardian's report on data sharing. So, Anneke, thank you so much.
I'm going to start off straight away by subverting the question. So rather than say, what does consent mean for Generation Genome, I'm asking, what does Generation Genome mean for consent? And I'm speaking as a clinician who seeks consent from patients to take part in a genomic exercise, and also someone who's very interested in the ethical aspects and has researched some of those over the years. In the background information to this talk, there was a lot of different terminologies used straight away, and I'm hoping that a lot of them will come out in the debate after our talks. So there's a lot of discussion about, are we talking about consent or are we talking about permission? Is there a difference between the two? The background literature seemed to suggest they were the same. I think there is a distinction between them. There is talk about donation, about sharing, and about access to. And again, I think they're quite different, but often used interchangeably. Likewise, confidentiality and privacy, and what consent can contribute to those. I think my question to you that I hope we can get some discussion about is it possible that we're asking too much of consent? Is consent alone sufficient to allow us to evolve Generation Genome, if you like? Or might we need something else? Can we just use that has a patient consented or not answer to progress, or do we need other things? And just to put that in a context, I think it's interesting to note that consent in clinical practice and research has a different emphasis. And in the Generation Genome, the 100,000 Genome Project, we're actually asking the consent to do both. So in clinical consent, it's usually for a treatment or an intervention deemed necessary for health. So my appendix is about to burst. I need to give consent for the surgeon to wield his knife to get rid of my gangrenous appendix. I need to know the risks and the benefit balance of that, but really I need to give my consent for that operation to prevent the surgeon being accused of assault and battery without that consent. And consent in clinical practice is often just one part of a clinical relationship involving trust. So that's a really important aspect of clinical consent, I think. Research consent is to describe the opposite pole, and I accept there's lots of gradations in between, is to take part in a research study for future health benefit. And the focus there is on altruism, on information sharing, and on minimising the risks of participation, very much in recognition of the Helsinki principles. It's a much more contractual relationship, consent and research, I think, and it tends to be much more freestanding, that the research cannot happen unless you've signed an informed consent form to say that you want to take part on an altruistic basis so that your autonomy is preserved. And I think there are implications for a venture that is hybrid, or perhaps alloyed. There's lots of examples in clinical practice where research and clinical practice entwine, so cancer clinical trials would be a very good example. But in the 100,000 Genomes project, your clinical diagnosis is dependent on participation in research. And I think that raises really interesting questions about what consent is doing here. You need 3 legs for consent to be valid. Consent requires 3 elements. And the first is that it's got to be given voluntarily. You've got to be free from coercion for consent to be valid. Yet in the 100,000 Genomes project, for example, you can only get your clinical diagnosis if you also agree to take part in the research venture. Now, I'm not saying that's coercion in itself, but we need to raise a question about whether that voluntariness there is immediately observed. The second leg for consent is that it's got to be informed. So if you look at the NHS website about what consent is, it says that you need full, I've put it in inverted commas, information about the risks and benefits about the proposed treatment or intervention. And it also says healthcare professionals should not withhold information. But in genomics, even the experts aren't fully informed about everything and can't give all the information there is to give. So again, there's a question there about whether that leg is satisfied. And the third limb is that the person must have capacity to decide and to be able to use the information presented to make an informed decision. And again, in genomics, there is much uncertainty about what a genomic result actually tells you. But that uncertainty actually exists in the context of a very deterministic debate. So again, in the background information, we were given an excerpt from a New Scientist article where one of the lines was that your genome is literally a description of you. Well, actually, it isn't. It's not literally a description of you. There's lots of other influences, but that's a good example of how the debate about genomics is described in a very sort of deterministic way, illustrated by lots and lots of media coverage. This is just a selection of one magazine that over the last 20 years has presented genetics and genomics in a very sort of deterministic way. And James Watson, in 1989, said, "We used to think our destiny was in the stars, now we know it's in our genes." In fact, I think the better quote for genomics is one that was made 3 decades earlier by John F. Kennedy, who said that the greater our knowledge increases, the more ignorance unfolds. And we are at that stage in genomics. Another example here, these are 10 a penny, these sort of headlines, particularly from the American media. This is about uncertainty resulting from genetic testing, but the interesting thing here is that this woman said when her result was unclear and it wasn't certain what she should do with that information, she said, "I didn't consent to this sort of result." So the question there is, what does that mean in that situation? What does her consent mean? And does the fact that she hasn't consented to it, is that a problem in this situation? So, as Bill mentioned, I was very fortunate to be asked to co-write a chapter for the CMO's report for 2016, but published in July 2017. And that chapter very much echoed some of the findings of the Nuffield Council report some 2 years earlier on the collection, linking and use of data in biomedical research and healthcare. What we talked about there was that we need to think about the permission to access genomic data, to use genomic data to get it to provide results as something broader than the consent yes-no toggle. So we drew on the original social contract in the NHS constitution, which very much emphasised that research needs to be integral to clinical practice and that trust and altruism, solidarity are important features of that social contract. And that consent needs to be seen as part of an ethics ecosystem rather than a standalone venture, so that there is an obligation to treat people with respect and ensure fair treatment and avoid discrimination, etc., as well as taking consent. We argue that alone consent can't do the job, and so the language that insists on it doing the job is problematic. And a yes-no consent toggle, has the patient sign the consent form, may run as many risks as not paying consent any respect at all, I would argue. And an example from our own centre, which I think is probably echoed around the country, is that in the 100,000 Genomes project, there is a fantastic team of recruiters across the country who spend a lot of detailed time with potential participant patients, often an hour and a half, giving information about taking part in this venture. And generally, participants are very happy with this interaction. They trust their healthcare professionals and they've signed an initial detailed forms, but have they provided valid consent, would be my question. And one of the reasons I ask you that question is that our survey of the first 1,000 participants in the Wessex GMC revealed that only 20% could recall whether or not they had consented to a particular feature of the 100,000 Genome Project participation, which is to additional findings, extra findings in your genome that are not related to the clinical reason for doing the test. And that figure dropped to 10% after 6 months. And some of those remembered wrongly, so they thought they had consented to additional findings when they hadn't, and vice versa. Only 30% could describe what additional findings were. Most of the participants took part to get a diagnosis and not necessarily for research. Now, none of these participants minded that, but arguably they didn't give valid consent if we look at the NHS and research definitions of consent, because they didn't know what they had consented to. And that's some of the papers that my group have published to show some of those findings. So I think one of the things that we need to discuss in the debate is consent the same as permission? Arguably, I don't think it is, because you can give permission to something without the voluntariness, the informedness, and the capacity. The ethics ecosystem suitable for generation genome is an important factor to discuss, so we move away from that consent-only discussion. That's not even touching about the possibility of consent to disclose or access for the benefit of others. So there are some very relevant recent court cases where consent was used as the toggle to see whether or not relatives could have access to particular information that was familial. And I would argue that there we're not talking about consent for disclosure, but actually about accessing familial information. Donation of data, access to data with permission, and what is an invasion of privacy in this context, and how can consent be used to prevent it? So if you see that page of my genome, is that invading my privacy to have that published, or is it not? I'll leave you with this cartoon, which I think highlights some of these issues. You probably can't see it very well, but there's a man walking his dog, and the dog's in the water. And we don't know whether the man knows his dog's in the water. But if we waited to see whether he'd signed a consent form to be told that his dog's in the water or not, the dog might have drowned by then. Or the man actually might know very well that the dog's in the water all along and it not be a relevant finding for him. So I think that raises or encapsulates some of the reasons why a consent toggle doesn't do everything.
Anneke, thank you so much. That's great for setting the scene on the book. So we're going to move on to introduce Professor Sue Hill. Sue's the Chief Scientific Officer at NHS England, and she's the Senior Responsible Officer for NHS Genomics Programme, and I'm sure will answer some of the points that Anneke has raised, particularly around the 100,000 Genomes project.
Thank you very much, Bill. First of all, thank you very much to Sarah and the Progress Educational Trust and to Genomics England for the invitation to speak here. I'm not an expert in ethics or consent, but as you've heard from Bill, I'm responsible for introducing into the NHS in next year a new NHS Genomic Medicine service and for our ongoing contribution to the 100,000 Genomes project. What I've done previously in my career is both clinical consent and also research consent for very early phase clinical trials. But just to set the context, this is a brief history of consent and learning. This is an evolution. Consent's been around for a long time, and since the days of Hippocrates, and also through all the ancient Greeks and the application of medicine. And it became more formalised in the 1800s, but also as we went into the 1940s and where medical research became the backbone of medical practice. And then you've already heard from Anneke about the Declaration of Geneva that came together to cement some of these principles. So we're building upon a history, really, of taking consent, but not in the way or the type of ways we're considering it that's been so eloquently set out by Anneke already. I want to really set the context for the conversation we're having, though, that in the NHS at the moment, this is the level to which we can undertake genomic testing. So about 1% of our whole genetic code can be tested in the NHS. What the 100,000 Genomes project is all about is using the opportunities of technology coming down in price to sequence all those letters in an individual's genetic code, and using the ability from computers and data analytics to really make sense of what this means for an individual patient. What I want to just set in terms of the context is this is very much like where we've been with imaging in the NHS, where we started with taking what are called plain chest x-rays, and we now take really complex images where a lot more information is generated than we actually utilise because of the technology that's available. So that's the context, really, for what it is we're doing and why we're having this conversation about where we are now in the NHS and where we'll be from next year when we start to introduce whole genome sequencing into the NHS on a routine basis. This slide, and I'm not going to talk through it, just illustrates to really understand whether something is abnormal or not, requires quite a detailed understanding of all those letters in an individual's code that is sequenced using whole genome sequencing. And this just shows you that even in a normal person, without reading any of the detail of what the acronyms mean, this is a complex piece of work that needs to be done. And it needs to be brought together with more information about an individual in terms of the type of signs and symptoms they have and other things about their medical history. And that's how you start to make sense of whether something is important in terms of causing a patient's disease, understanding whether a drug will be actionable or whether there's something that could be passed on to other family members. And I think this is just important to set the context for the debate that we need to have. And so these are the shared features of genomic and other consent. So one of the reasons we do that is so that we can use and compare patient information, that we understand the implications for other family members, that we can report anything else that might be seen when you start to look at that information over and above the presenting condition that the patient has presented with. That it enables us to start to work with industry in a way that means for the future in the NHS, that we can start to work with industry in a way, in a shared collaborative way, so that we start to make medicines and other types of interventions affordable in the future. Because at the moment everything's done in a parallel universe. And here, the reason for all consent, as Anneke's outlined, is the importance of trust and patient confidence. And I'm not going to get into the definitions because we're going to have a debate about that, but that's in simplistic terms what it is that we're talking about. And so what's different about genomic consent then? Routine care here requires the comparison of information because this is a fast-moving field and new genomic discoveries are happening all the time. And what might be important is that discovery may be in another country. And what we have to do in the NHS is give our patients the best possible care and the best possible outcome for them and their family. The second is significant pockets of expertise might lie outside of traditional clinical professions. And some of that is because it needs to be used by and interrogated by people who are experts in certain types of data analytics and applying some types of software that enable us to make comparisons, to start to understand whether something may or may not be associated with causing that disease and may or may not be able to be treatable. There's also an international dimension to diagnosis to make sure that across the world we can drive up the care for patients who are receiving genomic diagnoses. And that has many benefits, not just for people in other countries, but also for people in this country, particularly when we're trying to make sense of whether something is causing a disease or not. And then we also have to recognise that there's an ongoing societal change to the ability to access information and to, in some ways, also mistrust some of the authority that goes along with that information. In the 100,000 Genomes project, I think there's been a very systematic approach to the taking of consent, to working with an ethical committee, and to involving patients, and you're going to hear from Jillian, to involving patients really in the type of material. Some of the material that's been produced and the information that needs to be given to enable informed consent to happen is extensive, but it's extensive so that people really understand what they're signing the consent form for and that what their information can be used for. And Anneke articulated some of that in the very beginning. And this is an ongoing conversation with an ethical committee in considering how this is, the type of material that's used, how onerous it is, what it's described like, and also when the consent can be taken. So you've already heard from Anneke about CMO's genomic generation report. I was use this round the wrong way and I hope you've spotted that. And this is what the set of public dialogue conversations is coming out of. But what, as Anneke said, it mentioned four main things in this report. One, about consent and understanding that future care is more joined up and information driven. The secondly, the use of information, the care of treatment of patients and their relatives. The third is the duties and responsibilities of healthcare professionals, reflecting new ways of working. And the fourth is the responsibility of health systems like the NHS, given the pace of change. And that's why there's been the suggestion of this new societal contract. We've had, and Anneke's referenced the National Data Guardian report on genomics, and although there's no plans for formal guidance for genomics, there's focus on an ongoing collaboration. And what's been suggested through this report is a possible role for privacy impact assessments. And in the NHS, for everything we do and we introduce in the health system, we have to do an impact assessment, but we often don't do this type of assessment. And what's coming soon is the European Union General Data Protection Regulation being introduced in 2018, which will have wide-reaching impact, but there'll be a clear and affirmative consent to the processing of private data that has to be provided. And in this context, individuals have the right to be forgotten and lost to a system if they don't give their consent for the use of their data. So just to finish then, in developing the consent for the future NHS Genomic Medicine Service, it will evolve from what we're using in the project. And you've already heard from Anneke, this is a hybrid consent, clinical care and also research use. Information sharing inside the NHS for clinical care is proposed to be more standardised and more extensive and mandatory. Research participation and adding to a national tissue bank and a national database, so the UK Genomics database, will be optional on the basis of consent. And this will include a route for recontact for research purposes by researchers or perhaps by industry collaborators, and within the NHS itself for reanalysis of results over time, if that could improve the diagnosis and the care of an individual. The consent model then will be separable into clinical research and additional findings to allow maximum flexibility, and this is really important if we start to consider this in the context of cancer. Consent will be electronic, both for information giving and signature capture, but with face-to-face discussion and paper-based options being available. And then just to finish, this is what I'm saying. In summary, We've shared data for years under carefully controlled conditions to improve clinical care. Society has moved on and expects transparency and openness. We need an approach applied across healthcare, noting all the care necessary to focus on improvement. And finally, data not used for clinical care needs to be properly consented. I'll finish there and thank you very much.
Take a slightly different tack now and introduce my colleague here in Manchester, Dr. Tara Clancy. Tara is a consultant genetic counsellor here in Manchester and an honorary senior lecturer at the university, and also a member of the Nuffield Council on Bioethics. Tara, thank you.
I think, as already been discussed, consent can be problematic, but I think it's worth thinking about why, historically at least, we think it's so important. And it's partly an ethical basis and partly a legal basis. One fundamental thing is it shows that we respect people and their choices, and it's quite important to recognise that individuals have got really quite different attitudes and values, certainly different attitudes to risk-taking. And I think if we show as professionals that we respect autonomy, then that promotes patient-centred care and it also promotes patient-centred research. From a legal point of view, for patients and participants, it means it protects them physically. And then from the point of view of professionals and researchers, it means we usually don't get charged with battery, but it also sets limits to our actions and creates specific responsibilities. But as has already been said, it's not that straightforward. One of the real problems about consent, whether you call it informed consent or not, is it is often synonymous with autonomy. And there's quite a tension if we think about a focus on the individual and whether or not the focus on the family or the community to which the individual also belongs. It's also not that straightforward because I can decide whether or not I want to have my genome sequenced if I get offered that opportunity, and I wouldn't go to the conference where they're giving you that free. And I can decide whether or not to take part in research. But professionals, we should recognise we are gatekeepers, so we decide really which tests are necessary and appropriate. And we're also involved in developing testing and research protocols. So sometimes, well, it can be hard to sometimes remember it. It is important to remember that respecting choice is not the same as facilitating that choice, and that limited resources affect choices and actions. There's a lot of different ways people talk about in terms of either giving or seeking consent. Informed consent, as it's generally talked about, is often for a specific or really quite limited purpose, and then you might ask for further informed consent when new research is proposed. I mean, it's interesting because Anneke was saying about what terms mean, so and I was going to talk about data, information and knowledge, but that was confusing me. And I think I've possibly confused broad consent with blanket consent because they're very similar, they're not quite the same thing. So broad consent is appealing at some levels, I suspect. So it reduces the need to recontact patients or participants for further consent, and it reduces the burden for patients and participants in terms of their commitment. The problem is it's necessarily unspecific, and it's a very pragmatic solution. That doesn't necessarily mean it's a very ethical solution. Another possibility is to think about tiered consent, so people have a level of control over the future use of their samples or information. But there's equally evidence that information overload causes people to opt out of decisions, to make less informed decisions, and to experience greater regret about their decisions. A slightly newer way to approach things is dynamic consent, and that enables people to kind of consent in real time. And there's some suggestion, and so I think some evidence that that might improve understanding of risk. But it's also problematic about in terms of the burden of frequent or ongoing requests to reconsent, that the recontact might be for what at least some people would think would be quite trivial reasons. More information really does not mean better and more relevant information. And relying on electronic communication may exclude some individuals and groups. In terms of thinking about genetics, genomic database and biobanks, we know, I think, probably most of us probably here agree, that storing samples and data is a good idea because they can be available for clinical use and for research in the future. But when samples and data have been collected primarily or really for clinical purposes, then when you get into the boundary between clinical care and research, that's problematic, although that boundary is probably not as clear as we'd like to think it is, or probably never has been. Certainly the proposed research may not have been seen at the initial stage, and gaining consent may not be possible for logistical reasons. Certainly if there's any degree of de-identification of data, or it's a very large-scale research project, or you just can't track the people down. And one of the things that came out of the Nuffield Council work was to about trustworthy governance systems to engage with and reflect reasonable expectations. And I think if not, I think this is the case, that initiatives that we are positive about to provide public benefits may not secure public confidence. Now, that perhaps all sounds slightly gloomy to now. So my feeling is, in terms of consent, what's quite good to think about is getting the gist. And that's really the most important information, or general information without details. So the way that we think and process information, there's sort of two bits to it. One is quite deliberative, rational processing, a lot of attention to detail and numbers. And there's what we call the fuzzy mode, which tends to ignore details and focus on overall meaning or gist. And one of the interesting things is the fuzzy mode is mostly used making intuitive judgments by experts in highly skilled fields. And most of us can use both these forms of thinking at the same time. And when making judgments, there's very good evidence that the gist-oriented mode prevails, and that gist-based thinking is more advanced and typically leads to better judgments. I think this is evidence why very long, very detailed consent forms really are not worth the paper that they're typed on or the screen space that they take up. And what people really need to know, I think much more, is, well, what is the bottom line? Can I trust you, and can I trust you on an ongoing basis? Part of my brief was to talk a little bit about mainstreaming. I work primarily in cancer genetics, and there's good evidence that mainstreaming into oncology and surgery could be really beneficial. So if a disease-causing variant is identified early, that can aid diagnosis and management. So it might be, for example, that more radical breast surgery is appropriate. It might be that radiation is excluded because of an association with sensitivity. Chemotherapy regimes might be changed because some agents are more or less effective. And there's very good evidence already that targeted approaches to management of high-grade serous ovarian cancer and triple-negative breast cancer makes a great deal of difference to people's experience of the disease and also survival. But one of the big problems, and it's a problem in genomic practice, and I think in other specialities who are beginning to use genomic information, one is variants of uncertain significance. So these essentially, when there's not enough evidence to say, is this variant we found in the gene, is it benign or is it disease-causing? And that's found in about 7% of tests done for BRCA1 and BRCA2, which are the two genes known to significantly increase the risk of breast and ovarian cancer. Interpreting very significant requires a multidisciplinary team of scientists, bioinformaticians and clinicians. In terms of thinking about what does it mean for patients, and we'll talk about patients rather than participants in this case, it can introduce a lot more uncertainty about future cancer risks. It can be quite an additional burden at a challenging time of diagnosis and treatment. And there is evidence certainly that patients not only consider, but patients have undergone inappropriate surgery on the basis of a VUS. It's very unclear how a VUS is understood by patients. It's often recalled and conceptualised as a danger, and patients often think it's safer to think of it as a danger rather than as a normal variant. It's also unclear how VUSs are understood by non-genetic specialists, and there was one research project that found that testing was felt to be appropriate to offer for siblings who are known to carry a VUS. And then we get on to the question of secondary variants and incidental findings. Now I would agree, as many people here probably would do, incidental findings is not a new problem, but there's more of it, I suspect, now. So this is talking about genetic variants that are disease-causing but not related to the reason why the test was done. And that might be something that is, or is not, at least not yet treatable. we're not necessarily sure what the effect is, and it may also be relevant to relatives. And disclosure or non-disclosure of secondary variants is an issue in clinical and research contexts. And what we need to think about, and I guess you could write it the other way around if you think about it from a patient participant viewpoint. Do we disclose? Do we withhold? Do we proceed with caution? Do I want to know everything? Do I want to know only the things that are relevant to why I was being tested? What about qualified disclosure? Disclose secondary variants where there's definitely clinical utility and where there are treatment and prevention options. And where do children fit into all of this? I was also asked to say a bit about genetic cancers, and of course, unsurprisingly, I think there aren't enough of us. There are, I think, something around 3.5 full-time genetic cancers per million of the UK population. We're just starting the second year of Health Education England funded scientist training programme for genomic counselling. But as yet, there isn't any higher specialist scientific training programme for consultant grade genetic or genomic counsellors. And are we going to be needed in the future? I think we are. I think that people working in other specialities can and do a very good job, clearly, generally, but in terms of thinking about genetic testing. But I think there are going to be things, just as I couldn't claim to suddenly have the skills to be an oncologist. I think there are things, when you think about either particularly complex issues, including about families, and most families are complicated, but also in terms of thinking about rare diseases. That's the other reason I think we're still needed.
It's really helpful and wonderful now to have a different view, and that is going to be provided by Jillian Hastings-Ward, who's the chair of the participant panel for the 100,000 Genome project, and she's going to give a personal perspective on the consent process, on how her family signed up to participate. Thank you so much, Lee.
Yes, thank you for the introduction, Bill. I've been asked to talk about the consenting process that we have followed, having joined the 100,000 Genomes project as a family, as one of their first recruits to the main programme, which began in the autumn of 2015. We were looking for answers for our son, who is now 3 years old and is severely disabled due to an undiagnosed genetic condition. I've also today been asked to talk a bit about the important role that project participants play in overseeing the work of Genomics England, who, as you probably know, are custodians of our data. It seems to me that we've got an unrivaled level of involvement with decisions about what happens to our data, and that's a really good thing. And I would say this is a really good model to take us forward as we mainstream genomics into Generation Genome. The level of engagement that project participants have in decisions at present, it seems to be something that I would really wish for us to replicate. So this is just a little visual reminder that in some ways we are talking about real people, and this is the encyclopedia of us, that if we're talking about ethics and about consent in a purely professional level, then I think, as other people have alluded to already, sometimes regular participants may just be of the view, well, we said yes, but can we just get on with it, sort of thing. But behind every one of the 100,000 genomes stands a real person with real feelings, real rights and real expectations. But this isn't hypothetical science, and for many people it's real life. And if we are to see mainstreaming of genomics into the wider NHS, I really think we must involve patients in a meaningful and influential way. So our consent experience, I would say, was a very positive one, actually. You've seen already a slide that set out all the different iterations of the consenting paperwork which had been developed by the time we got into the project. And we were also able to speak to our geneticist in advance of giving the bloods that were taken. She had run all the tests that were available to her separately and had drawn a blank. My son is the most normal, not normal boy in the world. And so for us, this was the last resort to some extent. We had lots of literature to read about it beforehand. We did have the opportunity to speak to a genetic counsellor and to ask her extra questions beforehand, and then at the appointment where we were due to be giving bloods. We were able to check our understanding with her that what was meant by additional findings, for example, was something that we wanted to go for, actually. And we understood that the breadth of the consent reflected the wide-reaching scope of the project, and it is impossible to pin down all eventualities. The range of options that were offered involved having a result about the main condition that we were interested in, so could we find out what was wrong with our son, but also these additional findings which were explained to us in a very nice straightforward way as things which were either something that could be screened for or something that could be treated if they were found, and that seemed perfectly logical to us. Maybe that's the fuzzy thinking that you were talking about. So that was our straightforward experience, and then our sample got whizzed off to Genomics England, and it left us reflecting on that. And obviously our initial focus was on our son. Is this something which can help him? And if yes, it's a no-brainer. Of course we would want to do this. And as you were saying earlier, Anneke, that is the question about to what extent is this a voluntary decision, or are we really sort of in a corner? Is this the only thing that we can do now? Our diagnostic odyssey had already been 18 months at that point, and as I mentioned, all the other tests that had been run had been inconclusive. The secondary thoughts that came after that, though, were beginning to be around, well, what happens to the data after we have an answer, if we get one? We didn't know then, but we're now aware that Genomics England is the 100,000 Genomes project is a time-limited project, but the data is held in perpetuity, so what happens as we go forwards? Who holds the data in future? Who should be allowed access to it, and for what purpose? Will consent need to be revisited if our samples have a life beyond the 100,000 Genomes project? And all of these questions are ones which we are now starting to think about as the participant panel. But as others have mentioned already, trust is absolutely critical. Trust between the participants, or would-be participants, and the party or parties holding and using our data. Which brings me neatly on to the role of the participant panel in the 100,000 Genomes project, which I see as one of really strengthening the trust that there is between participants and the organisation currently holding our data, Genomics England. We are the independent patient voice. Although they very kindly offer us meeting space, we are fully independent of them, and they don't mind if we have constructive criticism, and in fact that's very much welcome, so that's good. Everybody on the participant panel has a personal connection to the project. Either we're on it because we have children or close relatives who have an issue which needs to be investigated, or we have a condition ourselves which affects our lives and or those of people who we're closely related to. That makes sense. So there's the two types. Either you're a participant because of your own condition, or because you're caring for somebody in a day-to-day environment who has a condition which is of interest. It does now include people with some forms of cancer, as well as the rare diseases bracket, which seems to be basically everything else that's not cancer. So there's a very wide variety of conditions within that. We get to oversee what happens to our data and hold Genomics England to account. And that sounds like a very sweeping statement, but we are able to invite anybody to appear at a panel meeting. And we're very fortunate that at the last one, Sue was able to come and join us along with Sir John Chisholm, who's chair of the board of Genomics England, and we were able to grill them after a short presentation. So, I really feel that this form of patient engagement really seems to be hitting at the heart of things, which is great. So yeah, we can escalate any serious concerns directly to the board and or the chairman if we feel things aren't working in the way that we would wish. We also have an active role in 3 other core areas of activity at Genomics England, and I just wanted to quickly whiz through those. There's an ethics advisory committee, which Anneke sits on, I discovered today, sorry, I should have known that. And their role is to identify, examine and respond to ethical issues in the project. They help to ensure that the project is delivered in the interests of the public and the participants. And it currently includes 3 participant panel members, so 3 people whose data is actually being sequenced and is actually in the project get the chance to come and speak to the Ethics Advisory Committee about the ethical issues which are coming up, which we think is a really strong situation. Then there's the GSIP, the Clinical Interpretation Partnership, which brings together all the researchers who want to study our data. It's split into domains, so there's one per disease or topic. There's about 40 altogether, I think. And there's some cross-cutting ones as well that look at the entirety of how this data is used in other ways. I'm sorry, they're very clever, and I'm not quite sure I'm completely au fait with all the detail. But each domain is putting together a proposal to look in the bank of data which is being collected. So the GSIP board oversees all the work that the research consortia will be doing, and currently includes 2 participant panel members. But then there's the Access Review Committee, which I sit on, and it decides who's allowed to study our data. So each of the domains has to put forward quite a detailed research proposal, who they would like to put forward to get into the data bank, what they want to do when they get there, and what they're going to do for patients as well as for academic purposes and clinical purposes afterwards. So we check that applications are in line with the stated aims of the project in the public interest and in the participants' interests. And at the moment there are 4 participant panel members who are able to come along to that. So again, we've got quite a strong voice there amongst all the scientists and the clinicians who are also on this committee. All of which seems to me like a very good thing. All 3 of these activities are strengthened by the involvement of actual participants. If nothing else, we're a physically present reminder that decisions being taken will have direct impacts on real people. But we can also bring perspective that may have been overlooked by the professionals. Just very simple examples about how information about the project is disseminated out. We know what it's like to be on the receiving end of an anonymous envelope or some findings that, or rather some communication that may arrive from Genomics England, and there is still a tendency, even though you may know that Genomics England won't be delivering your actual result, a lot of other participants, for example, may be quite concerned if they get an envelope that says Genomics England on it, not realising it's just a newsletter and their clinical findings are coming from elsewhere. So very simple messaging around just improving the communication is a thing that I think we're able to offer as well. I just wanted to leave you with these key points. There are very exciting possibilities for diagnosis, treatment and prevention offered by genomics, but trust is absolutely paramount. With no trust, people won't give you their data and then you can't do anything. I am strongly of the view that participant voices should be heard at the heart of institutions who are entrusted with this data now and in future, in decisions around the future use of existing data, and in decisions around the consent or consents that will be used to collect new data in the future. So it's really just a plea that we should all keep talking. Thank you very much.
The participant panel, do you have to be a signed up member of the 100,000 Genome Project? Do you have to have participated in the project to be a participant member? Because if so, do you think that you're already just taking the opinions and voices of those that have already agreed to participate?
That is a very interesting philosophical perspective that I hadn't actually considered, that as a self-selecting group to join the project, obviously we've agreed that the consent procedures are okay. Yes, yes, to some extent I think you're right. I suppose as we move forward through the process, we're now in a position where we can understand the implications of those decisions. And as someone else mentioned earlier, perhaps we get to the element of maybe not thinking that we'd made the right decision. Some people have now said they would like additional findings, having not previously asked for them, for example. Yeah. Similarly, I suppose there probably are some participants out there who, if they do get an uncertain response like the lady before, may wish that they hadn't asked. So.
In the 13 genomic medicine centres who are contributing to this project, we have asked all 13 to provide a representative for the participant panel. That hasn't been specified as being a participant or a family member. So, and what we expect is there will be some others who are people involved in hospital trusts around the country in their patient and public participation fora. So they may have a broader perspective. And I think it's important that we do look at a mixed economy here to make sure all the potential views are brought to the table. And I do think, though, the participant panel, although that's what it's called, it's really about how you engage individuals who will be impacted by the data that's being utilised, as well as some very practical issues about when your data is going to be returned as a result for you.
Thank you. So, Jillian, you sort of then raised the point about how people afterwards, like yourself, you thought quite deeply about what this meant for you, your family, and sometimes your thoughts change a little bit about not maybe the overall decision, but certain elements of it and what it means. And I think that comes to your point, Tara, around the dynamism, I don't know if I'm saying that quite right, but a dynamic process, and how consent might be at one point in time that you're giving it face to face with the person, but the opportunity to go and revisit that or elements of it. And how practical do you think that is? Do you think that's something that is achievable in clinical practice, Tara, or within research?
I think it should be feasible. I don't think we've worked out how to do it yet. And I think that's something that we should be focusing on, and it'd certainly be helpful to get sort of the participant, using that in a very generic sense, sort of view on that. I think part of the issue is that people would have, it's not going to be a uniform view about what counts as something additional and at what point you need to go back. So at least we think about the 100,000 Genomes project, knowing the oversight, I don't know if that's too strong a word to use, and that includes people already involved in it. I think that should give us some clues, but I don't think we've worked out a good way to do it yet. I think that's is occupying people's thoughts.
Anneke, yeah.
I think that's a really important question, because it depends on, if you want consent to do all of it, then consent is going to be very time consuming. If you really want to make sure that all those three limbs of consent are satisfied, you need to spend a lot of time on it. If you see consent as part of an ecosystem, then I think it's not to cut a corner, but it's to keep it in a context that makes it fit for purpose. So I think there's a lot of discussion about consent being very time-consuming and therefore not possible. I'd like to turn it around and say, make consent fit what we're trying to achieve there within a particular ecosystem rather than a standalone exercise.
Yes, please.
I think, Bill, we do need to open the debate, though, about additional findings in particular, because if you have a really extensive next-generation imaging investigation like MRI coupled with CT, very extensive, and that could be for the condition that you present for, that's been ordered. But if something else is seen, for example, if you have a mass in your abdomen, that will be reported as standard care within the NHS, even though that is theoretically an additional finding. Okay. Because it's part of how we holistically care for patients. We don't have the answer. I'm just saying this is the start of the conversation we need to have about the expectations of people who access the National Health Service and who want to get the best possible care as a result of that.
Sure. Anneke's going to come back to you.
She is. I know.
As you know.
She is.
You know what I'm going to say? Probably.
I do.
I mean, I think that's right. That there is no question. If you discover something that is actionable, that you know is going to have severe clinical consequences, you don't say, "Oh, have I got consent to disclose that or not?" You act on it. The problem with additional findings in genomics is that quite often you don't have that degree of certainty. You don't know what the action is. You don't know when it's going to arise, if it's going to arise at all. It might be another 20 years' time. And it might be relevant to relatives. So there's all sorts of additional features that make it less obvious than that MRI finding. I think you're right, that there is an equivalent. That's a starting point we need to look at. But we mustn't assume that all additional findings are in that category.
No, and I totally and utterly agree with you in terms of that. But we have to start this debate, especially when there is a level of certainty associated with it and what the expectations of individuals may be.
Give me one example that 100,000 genome additional finding is going to have that same level of certainty as an abdominal mass on an MRI scan.
The additional findings has been something that's been a very hot topic within the genomics world, certainly, and broader than that, because in the American College of Medical Genetics, probably about 4 years ago now, brought out some guidelines, recommendations that not just a couple of conditions, but up to about 50 conditions, I think they listed, 40-something conditions they listed, that if changes were found in any of these genes, if you were doing a whole genome analysis, that those genes would be specifically looked for, whatever the health problem you turned up with in clinic. They would look at these additional genes And irrespective of whether the patient or the individual wanted that information back, they would have to disclose that information back to the patient. So there was no patient choice, there was an absolute recommendation that there was a duty of the health professional to provide that information back to the individual who had undergone this type of testing. Now, there was a lot of discussion and debate about whether that was the right approach to take, and the European Society of Human Genetics took quite a different approach to that and said that this must be much more a dialogue between the patient and the clinician, health professional, about whether they wanted this additional information and how that would be fed back. And within the 100,000 Genomes project, there was a lot of discussion at the beginning of the project about which conditions we should really consider, that if you found a change in that gene, that really was what has been termed actionable. You could do something useful and immediate with that information, be it treatment or screening. And there's still an ongoing discussion about that. I don't think that's still quite a fluid thing. There's been some individuals that have said, well, you've missed out this condition, why don't we add that in? And then the concern, as Anneke has highlighted, about even the conditions that are on that list. We know a lot about them, but we don't still know, as John F. Kennedy sort of mentioned, as much as we think we know. And the more we know, the less we know, as you know. Right? I'm sounding a bit George Bush-like there, which is slightly disconcerting. But with all the agreement happening before, I think it was a bit David Cameron and Nick Clegg, so we won't have too much political stuff happening. So we're going to move on to opening things up to the audience.
Thank you to the Progress Educational Trust for opening up this discussion. So my name's Simon Belt. I'm an IT consultant. I don't work in the NHS or medicine, so to be involved in this is really, really useful. And thank you to Sandy for distributing the readings. One thing that really stood out at me about from the readings was this discussion about societal contracts that the NHS has, or is going to have, but it was mentioned in the slides about the constitution that the NHS has. I didn't know anything about this. I don't work in the NHS. This is news to me. And I think it's very important because what was coming out from a lot of the speakers was this whole notion of trust and the importance of maintaining a trusted relationship with society. The societal trust, the societal contract, to me sounds like an internal NHS discussion where you work out what you do yourself, but you use the language as though there's a conversation between the NHS and patients and the rest of society. I don't feel there is. So could you elaborate a little bit more about what this societal contract is?
My name's Chapman. I'm a PhD student at Goldsmiths, and I'm looking at public engagement with genetics. And my background is psychology and behavioural genetics. So my question is about genome-wide polygenic schools. Colleagues have published a paper last year that found you sum a great number of SNPs, you can make a fairly good prediction. You can predict about 10% of the variance in school achievement. And I just wonder what your thoughts are on that kind of more behavioural, less disease aspect of genetics.
Slightly different area, but something that's really very pertinent and something that will emerge from some of the data that we're looking at. And we're talking today predominantly about genome sequencing within the healthcare service, but we know increasingly there's a lot of access to genome sequencing without and out with that environment, and people having the opportunity to look at that. So that's an important thing for us to consider. Other questions? I feel like David Dimbleby. That's good.
My question is to Jillian. I'm Sash. I'm one of the clinical bioinformaticians, the first cohort of STP trainees. My question is, you said you got involved in this project because you wanted to know what next for your son's diagnosis. If you knew ahead, for example, that it might not lead you on to the result that you were looking for, would you still have participated in this? My second question following that is that if you knew that it might not give you the result, but it might be beneficial for other patients, would you still be involved in this?
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Stewart. Patient advocate, cancer patient. Jillian, thanks very much. That was brilliant. Question I have now from any of the panellists. How do you think technology, mobile phones, will change the face of consent? So, will we actually be more of a less information giving and more of an interaction and trust?
Thank you very much, David. A very good point. I think people that use all sorts of gadgets and tools are able to sort of, in terms of dynamic consenting, be able to engage in that ongoing process and feel much more comfortable about using data and sharing data and less nervous about some of that. But that's something that we can pick up with the panel. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is ask Jillian if you feel, because I know time's moving on, if you'd like to just pick up the question about your particular involvement with the study and the sort of uncertainty, and would you still do what you did?
Yeah, I think as the parent of an undiagnosed child, you just have to keep living week to week, and you just live with the symptoms that they present you with. So in the same way as any other child, you just grow with them to some extent. But there's a question there about whether in fact it's better not to know, whether if you're going to get a result that tells you that your child's liable to have a very short lifespan, for example, is that something that you'd want to know in advance, or is it not? And that is a gamble, I suppose, that parents take when they sign up for the project. That they in our case, we were aware that there was a risk that we could get that finding, and that would then have to be something else for us to deal with. But our counsellor explained it very carefully at the beginning, and we decided it was worth the risk. If you do get a finding which perhaps only gives a name for the gene, at least you've then got a name, and then you can start finding other people with variations on that gene, and then take things forward. And actually, there's a possibility that they may have identified one of the genes in my son, which now may have been causing quite a few of his difficulties. It's subject to further testing, but that obviously has a name, and then once you have a name, then you can start finding other people in the same boat. And then it gets quite frightening, because then you can start thinking, well, actually, if it turns out that all the other children who've got this variation only lived until they were 10, then that's quite a thing to get your head around. For us, there's not quite that degree of morbidity about it, but it still only takes us a certain way forward. It's not the whole answer. For us, it's not the case that they can go, right, it's this gene and it's actually action, like something we can do to help you, and then everything will be better. That was never something that we thought. And for us, as other speakers were differentiating at the beginning, this difference about consent for clinical things compared to consent for research, we were very focused on the research element, and it was an altruistic decision for us, and we have no regrets about that.
Thank you very much. Yes, Susie, were you wanting to just answer that?
I wanted to make, I think, two comments, and one comes from my involvement with the 100,000 Genomes project, and I think just to share with everyone, on one Saturday morning I went to the Royal Free Hospital in London, where they were going, or they hoped to recruit 50 patients with a particular type of kidney disease. And on that Saturday morning I spoke to all 50 patients and their family members. And what was clear, actually, at the end, was they all knew that the outcome might not actually help them. It might not give them a diagnosis. Even if it did give them a diagnosis, there may not be a treatment, and some of those individuals have had life-limiting kidney disease. But what they all wanted to do was really help other people, and help other people not just necessarily within this country, but in other countries. All 50 patients signed the full consent form. And I think it just illustrates really where we are actually with some patients and their family members who have these very difficult diseases to diagnose, but that it is a much broader conversation. The second point was more about the fact how we start to engage society in this broader conversation, because that's essentially what drove that understanding. And then how we also move the patients and our public on about decision making, not being about one single clinician. It's about how you get a safe decision making that involves more than one person, if we've got the level of uncertainty that we've heard about in terms of making sure that it is a known association before that is communicated. So that's something we haven't touched upon, but that's really at the heart of what we're talking about, and we're talking about for the future.
Thank you. So one of the things that I think about in terms of the patients that we consider to recruit to the 100,000 Genome Project, they fall into two categories in my mind. Those individuals where you're very confident what the diagnosis is, but it's just that there's no laboratory around the world that's offering that genetic testing, or you know what the test is that you'd want, you know what the gene is, but you can't access it for a whole range of reasons. And then there's another group of people, like Jillian, who has a family member or has affected themselves by a condition that we just don't know yet. And it could be one of the conditions that we know but haven't identified the gene change because as a doctor or a clinician we've not thought about it, or the condition it's showing itself in a slightly different way than we would have expected. And so I think there is sort of two groupings, and then in that second group I think there's a much greater chance of identifying something that is more challenging, that does make you think, gosh, this is a really profound decision I'm making here, that could tell us a lot of extra information, not just for me but for other family members. And that's quite a responsibility that you take on when you're signing that form, which maybe isn't quite the same as the responsibility you take on as an individual when you have a scan or another type of clinical investigation. So I think I'd be keen to hear what other people think about that. But I'm just going to carry on, pick up Sue's point about the first question that Simon raised about this societal interaction and about what the NHS's contract is with patients and how we engage that. And Jillian's very eloquently sort of set out, as a panel, you feel very engaged, you feel as if you're really making a contribution. But that's a very small group of people, and there are millions of people in the country that maybe don't feel engaged. And recruiting 70,000 people to this project is a wonderful thing, but then there are still going to be pockets of people that we haven't really connected out to. And how are we going to achieve that? Lots of questions.
No, lots of questions, but 55 million people are a lot to get around, and that's the amount of people we've got to get around. But I think what the Chief Medical Officer's report really helpfully said is that we've got to do more public dialogue. The public dialogue, and we're working between Genomics England and NHS England to think about how we engage the broader public rather than just the patient population. But I think going back to the question that was asked, although the NHS Constitution sets out a clear social contract actually for members of the population, for professionals and others within the system, I'm not sure that it's very well known about in the system. And so part of the work we've got to do is to make sure that we promote that in a way that perhaps hasn't been promoted to date. But it is very clear, and Anneke touched on it, and I'm sure you may want to say something too. But I think it's time that we've got to have a much broader conversation than just with a very polarised group of patients.
I think I saw the NHS social contract as an opportunity. So in this country we've got a National Health Service. We might not always see that in action, but it's very much in contrast to the health system in other countries, for example in the United States, where it's not, that contract doesn't exist in the same sort of way. So we've got an opportunity in this country to capitalise on the National Health Service to get something that is not so easy in other countries. It's an opportunity that the social contract offers, rather than it's a bit of paper that says you must do this or you must do that. It's a sort of opportunity in contrast to very privatised health care. And then I just wanted to pick up the question about other things that we might get from our genome, because I think that's really important.
Yeah, sure.
So the 100,000 Genomes project is very much focusing on rare diseases and cancer, and some people have described that as the low-hanging fruit from genomics. But as you very nicely highlighted, there are lots of other things that we can get from a whole genome as well, and we haven't really focused on that because we've been targeting rare diseases and cancer. But you're quite right, we might infer all sorts of probabilities or tendencies from a genome that don't really sit very comfortably within the National Health Service. That's not the aim of the National Health Service. And similarly, things about ancestry or indirectly ethnicity we could infer from genomics that you can buy over the counter, and then might lead you to infer something indirectly about your health that then overlaps with a health system. And I think that's a really interesting area to look at, that it's possible now for 99 quid to find out all sorts of things about your SNPs, as you mentioned, but also about your ancestry and about disease tendency that fall completely outside the National Health Service. And I think that's a really interesting area that we need to work together a whole lot more.
I work in genomic medicine here, and have done for a long time. I was interested in your question about engaging society, and in fact, you might not know, but the building we're sitting in was paid for by the DH and the EU as part of the so-called genetic knowledge parks, and the one here in the northwest was focused almost entirely on public engagement, as well as things like health economic assessing things. But if you look round, the pictures on the wall are a public engagement exercise where we went to the Arndale Centre and asked people whether they wanted to have their picture taken, and then it was morphed, and that got a huge engagement with it. The schools programme that they've run from here, and I think is still going on, was aimed at getting busloads of kids in here to extract DNA from kiwi fruits and then to have a discussion about the ethics. And there have been lots of other public engagement activities over the years here, particularly focused on genomics, that actually I think are a good way of starting the debate with people that wouldn't normally stand up, or even also things, people from hard to reach communities as well.
Hi, my name's Laybourn and I'm a law graduate, and I currently work at Hempsons. In terms of consent, when you're looking at these kind of projects, do you think that it has kind of two aspects to it? So for example, you have like one aspect which is collection and storage, and then the second aspect which is like data sharing and analytics. So if you look at the recent the recent report by the Information Commissioner Office into DeepMind and the sharing of the data analytics there in terms of trying to project acute kidney injuries, do you think this is kind of a similar project, and do you think collaboration with other trusts that are trying to run these kind of projects would help in terms of figuring out what consent means in this context?
I'm Ronnie, I'm a clinical scientist at the Genomic Medicine Centre in Manchester. I was going to mention about the separating the different strands of consent, because I completely agree with that. And I was going to pick up on Anneke's point about the first arm of consent being that it must be voluntary, but there are sort of opt-out models of consent that are adopted elsewhere in the world, and also for different strands of healthcare ability. So if you think about organ donation, there's talk about there being sort of an opt-out model of that. Would the different strands of this project, could you consider some that are more amenable to an opt-out model, and some are far more amenable to, or certainly require, an opt-in model?
Steve Lloyd from Huddersfield University. I am very impressed with Jillian's talk about the genomic projects, and actually she highlighted the projects is life-limited projects. And then I want to therefore ask Sue, because when she was talking about the data. So the life-limiting projects, the data, then you're going to share with industry at some stage. And will you need consent from the participants again? Because I think what Tara alluded to might require a dynamic kind of a consent process. And therefore, I mean, in the old days, I mean, quite old now, and then we're always a bit suspicious with working industry. Because what happened, industry want to most probably have the low-picking fruit, as some of your colleagues here suggested. And therefore, they will most probably target the money-spinning conditions instead of the important condition, put it that way. Therefore, there's some kind of things about life limiting of the projects, continual consent in some way might need to be dynamic, and how these projects will then relate to industry will be a very interesting discussions, I think.
And I think that's really interesting that we do have a tendency to always talk about consent. It's always consent, isn't it? And actually sometimes we might want to rephrase that and say we're listing a series of assumptions. In order for us to provide a genomic medicine service or an organ donation service, we presume that if you take part in this, you will sign up to the following factors. And then you should give people the opportunity to say, no, I don't sign up to that. But signing up to a presumption is slightly different from a yes-no consent, isn't it? And I think it's really interesting to think about when are we actually telling people that this is a presumption we make about them engaging with a particular clinical service. So, for example, in clinical genetic services, I might make it explicit to patients that I presume, because they've come to me to ask about their family history of a particular condition, that there's a two-way traffic, that once I find something in them, their relatives might also have an interest in knowing about it. And I might list that as a presumption rather than as saying, have I got your consent to disclose that to relatives? So I think it'd be really interesting to have a debate about when are we actually talking about opt-out consent, or are we talking about opting out of an explicit presumption that we're making? And I know that's semantic, it's always language, but I'm very keen to move the debate away from everything being consent, signed, electronic, or not. And I think that's your point's really important about using apps to get consent, but that's more about how you get consent. I think we have to decide, is it consent or not that we're after, and then about how do we obtain what it is that we're after. And yes, apps and interactive methods are going to be really important in that, rather than sitting to someone talk to you for an hour and a half about what the risks and benefits might be.
So, Anneke, I'm going to pick up a question which I'd like Sue to respond to, which was coming back to right to your talk, where this idea of the consenting process being voluntary, and which I think probably leads a little bit into the point that was just made by Ronnie here, about the participants have to sign up to the whole part of the programme. And is that something that is envisaged in the future as we move this testing into routine clinical care out with the project, that there's going to be that same sort of requirement for individuals to sign up to every element, or that there's going to be broken down so that you can sign up to some elements and not others, and that can change over time? So, Sue.
We're looking at everything in terms of the future model, and that's because we're moving whole genome sequencing into routine diagnostic care. It's a going to become a routine diagnostic test in the future. I think what we're looking at then is the type of consent model that is appropriate for that, and it fits with other diagnostic tests across the whole of the NHS. But as you can imagine, it goes back to the question that was posed around data sharing. There is a set of conditions that we need to consider when we start to perhaps share some of that data for clinical interpretation purposes that we have to look at, or indeed the consent that's required for use by researchers that would enable that to happen without going through another process, which is really important, or might be applicable to any industry collaboration, and I'm going to come back to that. So we have a legal team that's working on this with us at the moment, as you could imagine, and using all the case law examples that are emerging at the moment, and particularly what's emerged around Google DeepMind, for example. So we're looking at this across that continuum, from giving consent, from sharing data, and trying to separate the different elements, which, I think Anneke outlined very helpfully to start with. I think going back to the question about collaborating with industry, and what I think we haven't touched on yet, but as we start to use more extensive genetic tests to really understand the underlying cause, we will have smaller and smaller groups of patients with particular types of characteristics relating to that particular disease. So there is an assumption that common disease may become rare because you'll start to get sub-segmentation of those diseases. If you think about what that might mean to discovering new drugs to treat those genomic variants, especially if they may have an impact on how you respond to a drug, we have to get into a new way of working with industry to make it affordable for them to discover the drug and to do the clinical trial, and for the NHS to actually pay for it. So this is about a conversation all around the future sustainability of the NHS, rather than having an increasing drugs budget. And currently the drugs budget in the NHS is 16.8 billion, that's for all of our drugs, set to rise to over 20 billion. And NICE, the organisation that tells us about efficacy of drugs, say that only between 30 and 50% are effective. And some of that is because we're not matching people with their characteristics, including their genomic characteristics, with how they'll respond to a drug. And patients get adverse drug reactions and side effects. So this is part of a much bigger conversation I think it's leading us to, including any collaboration with industry. But whatever we do with industry has got to be on the basis of full consent from individual participants or patients.
Sorry, Anneke, I was just going to pick up on that sort of societal relationship, which I think it comes back to some degree, because I lived in Canada for a short period of time, and at the beginning of the year you get a leaflet which tells you exactly what you're entitled to as part of your healthcare package. And so if you need physiotherapy, you can get physiotherapy, but you're only allowed 6 sessions. And if you need anything more than that, you have to take out a policy that covers that. Now, some people say, well, we don't want to go down that route in this country because that leads to rationing. But it was a much more, I felt, open relationship, that you felt that there was this is what you are going to get, and if you're not going to get that, then what are you going to do about that? For some people that's going to be very challenging, because there isn't maybe the safety net if they need that. But that's something that we've not done well in this country. We've just felt that we can keep having everything, and people want to pay less for that, and that's a real problem. And whether what we're offering now in genetics and genomics, with all this extra additional findings, the downstream consequences of that, have we really assessed that? And if we take that forward, is that going to mean that people won't be able to have their hip operations or other elements of care, which might be just as important and just as relevant? And getting that balance right, I think, is absolutely key. So it's about being honest and open as much as anything. Anneke, sorry.
Yeah, I think that, just to echo that, it's about building up trust, isn't it? And your comment about Google DeepMind, I think the biggest criticism there was lack of transparency, not about not getting consent. So the risk of always reducing a conversation out of consent, did we get consent or not, misses something there, because actually it's trust, it's transparency, it's all the ecosystem around consent that we really need to focus on more, rather than that signature or the mantra of, well, have we got fully informed consent, whatever that means.
And it really is the difference. It's about this, as you started this very conversation about, which is the difference between data sharing and consent that we have to come back to. And there's no doubt about it. I was also just going to respond to the technology question. In this space, we're going to have to respond to a whole raft of different technologies. It might be around consent, but it also might be how can we start to take data that's driven by consumer-driven and over-the-counter technologies. How can we start to bring that data into the National Health Service so that it can be utilised and combined with other data so that it makes sense for individuals and their families and what needs to happen.
Thank you. I'm Fiona, I'm a health psychologist. I've conducted some work looking at consent in newborn screening. We've just been looking at how do you communicate with parents about newborn screening and whether or not we need a new consent one. And it's been really interesting hearing your debates tonight because one of the issues we faced in that project was that the sole focus on gaining informed consent was actually driving midwives to behave in ways that actually made it very difficult for parents to take on the information because the drive was behind getting a signed piece of paper rather than actually ensuring that parents understand it. And one of the concerns we have around that is how, yes, a lot of the development of that material has been around how do we gain consent, and what we've started to try and argue in newborn screening is actually if you don't base your practice on maintaining societal trust, then actually that's a far bigger risk. And that we have similar issues in newborn screening as well, so there's issues around unexpected results, storage of blood samples, and actually we've come up to a similar kind of conclusions from that work, is that actually you do need to differentiate what are you asking parents to agree to in terms of clinical implications for their child, and what are you asking for in terms of research purposes. So yeah, fascinating debate.
So I was wondering, what do you currently do when you find genes that are associated with an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease? And do you think there is an obligation to tell people of findings that may influence their lifestyle choices?
I'm Jillian from Campen, and I'm working at Sheffield Diagnostic Genetic Service on a project to assess the technical feasibility of NGS, next generation sequencing for newborn screening. So just to kind of tie in with that other newborn screening question, how would consent work in a screening pathway where you haven't really got an option to ask everybody for consent? Is consent a completely the wrong idea for that kind of pathway? And also, would it be better to focus on all just the mutations that you are sure are definitely clinically actionable or inevitable, and never consider any variants of unknown significance?
My name's Tina. I'm a parent representative for the charity Swan UK that stands for Syndrome Without Name. My question is, do you think that the amount of time that it takes to get results would have any implication on whether you'd be able to gain consent from participants?
Hello, I'm Felix, and I just finished my PhD on public trust in the healthcare system.
And the what system?
Public trust in the healthcare system. And I was looking at Genomics England, biobanking, and gather data. So I have a more conceptual question. You talked a lot about trust, and trust is a big concept, right? So whom should participants trust? And the second question is, how long should this trust last?
So I was actually going to just respond to the question about actionability. I think that comes into newborn screening and what you raised. You said, should we just be disclosing actionable results? In a way, if we say we're just going for diagnostic or actionable results, then that makes it slightly easier, doesn't it? Because that's the task we're charged with, to make a diagnosis or to find something that has a treatment. But I suppose what I point out is that actionability doesn't have a clear definition, and what's actionable, or what I as a clinician might say is actionable in terms of is there a good treatment, might be very different to what a patient wants to know about what's in their genetic code. And a good example of that was a recent court case that talked about disclosing a risk of Huntington's, where the clinicians said, well, it's not an actionable condition because there's no treatment for it, yet the patient thought that there was an action that could result, which was not having children or terminating a pregnancy. So actionability itself is problematic because you can't clearly define it. So although there is a call for let's just disclose actionable variants, I think that's a really difficult one to answer. Not only is a treatment or not, but also at what level of penetrance or certainty about that variant having an effect would you then disclose it? Would you say 10% penetrance, i.e. 10 out of every 100 people who have that variant will have some sign of the disease? Is that enough? Is 2% enough? Or is it 80% or more? So it's those sort of questions, I think, that make it really difficult. And just highlight how tricky it is to make rules around these issues.
Well, sort of following on from that, I think the question about actionability, someone was about Alzheimer's, I think. And I think it was about lifestyle choices. And I think, interestingly, the evidence that's out there is it probably doesn't make much difference to people's lifestyle choices outside of single genes of very high penetrance. So I think there's evidence in terms of smoking, for example. If you have a high risk, well, you may as well continue smoking anyway, or if you've got a low risk, you may as well continue smoking. So I don't know that there's that much evidence in terms of the more lifestyle end of things that will make a huge difference to choices that people will make. In terms of newborn screening, the focus on consent doesn't seem to be working because I think there's evidence that people don't really know what they're consenting to, and that's, I think, the usual sort of thing. You get a load of blurb at the beginning of a pregnancy and you're expected to remember it all and you're expected to remember it for the next pregnancy. I guess what's difficult about screening is that for most situations you're not going to find something to be concerned about, so it can feel a bit different. Of course, if you're the parents and your baby's the baby, the rare baby that's affected, it's probably going to feel different. But I don't think we've really worked it out very well. I mean, we're struggling when we're seeing people where we think at least there's a high chance we're going to find something relevant. I mean, I'm not so convinced about the shift about consent. I mean, the point that Ronnie raised about opt-out, I mean, that's quite an interesting one. I think I read something recently because there was some suggestion about moving to opting out in terms of organ donation in England as well in Wales. But in fact, although the data isn't very old, so we don't know yet, the number of organ donations has gone down in Wales since opt-out was introduced. So that could backfire a bit, I suspect.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's the downstream consequences that we think this is a really good idea, but until we've really assessed it, we don't know. Can I pick up on the point about the consenting, and would you give consent if you knew that it was going to take so long to get the result of the diagnosis, or does that, does your consenting thoughts, is that right, change over that time if there is that sort of uncertainty?
I don't know. I mean, I've not been asked to give that sort of consent myself, but I know in our practice it wasn't that long ago that it was, at least from when we saw people, when we got results from genetic testing, it was up to 3 years, whereas now it's 2 months. I guess when it was 3 years, we were able to let people know that. I suspect it probably could make a difference. I think it depends. I think there's some evidence that a lot of people taking part are not necessarily expecting an answer for themselves. It's an answer for other people in a similar situation in the future. Whether or not that's because we think we ought to show we're very altruistic and we're not really as altruistic, I don't know. I don't think it's that clear. I think the important thing is to be able to give people an idea about the length of time and at what point. The other important thing is what point can they draw a line under it, never mind what point we draw a line under it.
Thank you. Sue, you wanted to
I just wanted to comment about the length of time, because I think there's a position within the 100,000 Genomes project, and remember that is a world-leading project, and I know that from having listened to all the projects across the world, and this has really tried to create an infrastructure that will enable us to go forward with a clinical service for the future in terms of having a semi-automated clinical interpretation pipeline. So one, it has taken time, but there's been very good reasons why, and some of that is to make sure the robustness of feeding back. When we move into an NHS clinical service and we have diagnostic testing up to the level of a whole genome sequence, we would expect those results to be turned around in a clinically meaningful time. And so there are NHS operational standards for diagnostic tests. That may not be possible for all the genomic tests we're talking about, but we're certainly talking about taking it down to a much shorter time period of time so that it is clinically meaningful for the individual and for the family members.
Yes, and we're starting to see that progression. So, and just the final point to come to each of the panel before we round up. Felix's profound philosophical question about who we should trust. So, who should we trust? Because as a clinician, sometimes I feel that I'm in a relationship to take consent from a patient around a certain element of their care and consenting them for this testing. But actually, how much control do I have when that data goes somewhere else and can be shared by other people? So, should the patient trust me, or are they being asked to trust a broader system?
I think we're asking them to trust a broader system, but I'm not sure that patients know that that's necessarily what we're asking them to do. Equally, I think what we have to learn to do is trust our patients. I think it's really important we don't have higher expectations of our patients than we have of ourselves in terms of, for example, sharing information. But I think if there are, I mean, what Jillian was describing in terms of the oversight, which includes but isn't limited to the sort of patient participation in, for example, 100,000 genome projects, I think that gives a different insight into what it means to trust. But I guess I think fundamentally you can't know every relationship's based on trust, and most interactions we have with people are based on trust. Sometimes that's misplaced, but most of the time it isn't, I think.
Thank you, Tara. Anneke.
Yes, I think I would want to see trust as something that builds up in some relationships, not necessarily in all, but that helps to make sure that we don't have to use consent as the only tool to doing something. So that doesn't answer your question of who do we trust, but I think we could build on a mechanism where we make it clearer that if things go wrong, there are certain penalties that result. So at the moment, really, because we're focusing so much on consent, we only really deal with what goes wrong if we don't get consent. And I think that's problematic, as I've hopefully highlighted, that we don't always get consent in the way that we think we do. But if we said, actually, you're taking part in this venture based on a whole series of presumptions, we won't do this, we won't do that, but you can be confident that if there is a transgression, if I do identify the genetic father of Prince Harry whilst actually I was doing something else, meaning to do something else altogether, then there are penalties, and for having that trust misplaced. Sorry, I haven't said that very well, but there, if we make it clear in the system that there is a governance setup that will also penalise the people in whom trust has been wrongly placed, then that might help in the National Health Service.
One, I agree with my colleagues. I think it's trust in a broader system with the appropriate sanctions when that trust is in any way compromised. The final point I wanted to make is, and I think it's, Jillian isn't here, but I've seen the real benefits of having participants in the 100,000 Genomes project part of the processes, part of, in some way, defining and agreeing to the access, for example, of data in an NHS where patient-centred care is at the centre of it, and that what we want to do is ensure we deliver the best possible care for our citizens. We have to involve patients and the public in those conversations going forward, and in doing so we will also engender the trust of the great British people and their trust in the NHS. Thank you.
Thank you, Sue. Thank you very much. There's nothing left for me to round up and say because it's been articulated so well by my colleagues on the panel. I'm going to ask Sarah just to round up the evening. Thank you.
As I said at the beginning, we're a small charity, so please consider joining our membership scheme and becoming a friend of pet. Some of you in the room already are. Thank you, we love you. If some more of you joined us, then we can afford to put on more events like this and travel out of London more often too, which would be great. So the next one is going to be in Sheffield on a completely different topic about the Dian blood case and people using the sperm and eggs of their partners once they've died, because it's 20 years, for some of us who remember when it happened, it's 20 years since that judgment. My goodness, time flies. And that's on the 24th of October. And then we've got our annual conference coming up in December, and that is Crossing Frontiers, Moving the Boundaries of Assisted Reproduction, of Human Reproduction. And that's going to be looking at the latest scientific developments and the legal and ethical challenges that they give rise to. So creating eggs and sperm in the lab, or the sort of pushing the boundaries of genome editing and what's currently legally allowed. So that's what we've got coming up, and that's our marketing bit done. So I'd really like to thank our partners this evening, Genomics England. We're looking forward to doing more of the same on the road with you guys in a different city. And I'd like to thank the wonderful volunteers, particularly those who've volunteered for us for the first time here in Manchester. Thank you very much. It's great to have some local people helping out. And last but by no means least, I'd like to thank the speakers, Anneke, Sue, Tara and Jillian in her absence, and also Bill for being such a fantastic chair. He was like David Dimbleby, but much younger. It's great. Thank you.